At the family reunion dinner, my mother Victoria looked me dead in the eye, steady, cold, and proud of the cruelty she was about to unleash. "Reginald," she announced to my father, her voice slicing through the room, "she was never our daughter. She was a burden that needed to be eliminated." I felt the poison burning slowly beneath my ribs, a silent betrayal swirling in the wine they'd poured with a smile. What they didn't know, what they never understood, is that you don't quietly dispose of a CIA agent. They didn't end a problem. They detonated a war. My name is Bethany Clark. I'm 29 years old, and for the first time in more than a decade, I'm returning to the place that created me and tried to destroy me. I was born Bethany Montgomery, but that name died the night my parents locked the doors and told me to disappear. The rented car rolled through the shadowed avenues of Woodside, California, where old money glitters like polished lies. I'd landed at SFO barely an hour earlier, yet the sunlight already felt unfamiliar against my skin. Towering estates hid behind iron gates, each one a fortress built to keep out the rest of the world. And then there it was, the Montgomery Mansion, the largest and coldest of them all. A fortress of glass and stone. My childhood prison. My first battlefield. As I stepped onto the granite entryway, its chill crept through the soles of my shoes. I was home, and they had no idea what was coming. Then I spotted Mrs. Wilkins, our longtime maid, the sole individual who had ever offered me genuine warmth there, sneaking me a hidden chocolate treat during my younger days. Her gaze locked onto mine, filled with unspoken concern before she offered a quick, barely noticeable nod of caution and curtsied. It was an unmistakable alert. Before I could respond, my mother Victoria emerged. She appeared flawless in a pale beige Chanel gown, her stance impeccable. The aroma of her Chanel No. 5 fragrance created an intangible barrier as she rested her palms on my shoulders in what resembled an embrace. It was a detached, rehearsed act. "Bethany," she uttered, her tone as polished as silk. She stepped away, her gaze conducting a rapid judgmental assessment. "You seem toughened. There's an untamed quality to you." A moment of quiet, not like our kind. It wasn't a greeting, it was a conclusive verdict. The meal was presented at an expansive oak dining table, its polish shimmering beneath the harsh illumination of a Waterford crystal fixture. The cuisine was a display of extravagant indulgence: flawlessly grilled Wagyu steak, tender green beans, and a vintage wine pricier than my initial automobile. My father, Reginald Montgomery, the head of Montgomery Security, discussed a fresh multi-billion-dollar agreement with the Department of Defense. My sibling Ethan, although not present, was the highlight of the night, his recent success at a Bay Area startup lauded with fatherly admiration. I was merely an afterthought. "And what about you, Bethany?" my father inquired at last, his eyes avoiding direct contact. "Still content with your clerical position?" "It's rewarding," I replied, the falsehood bitter on my tongue. Victoria let out a subtle, patronizing chuckle. "Well, at least it occupies your time. A simple life is the most we could anticipate for her, right, dear?" "Consistency is essential," my father declared, his voice emotionless. "You get that, Bethany?" "Oh, I got it. I was the disruption that required control." Victoria even boldly spoke of her newest charitable endeavor, a foundation for orphaned youth. The irony was so intense, it bordered on impressive. Then the wine arrived. Victoria raised a bottle of 2015 Screaming Eagle, a vintage whose cost could sustain a household for weeks. She filled my goblet generously, the rich crimson fluid twirling like a sinister vow. "Drink up, darling," she instructed, her grin flawlessly arranged. "To your homecoming." My conditioning, shaped in the relentless trials of the training grounds, blared warnings. Every sense was heightened. I lifted the glass, sampling a tiny analytical taste, sufficient to detect. That one taste was plenty, The subtle yet distinct bitter edge trailed by a gradual warming in my esophagus. It was a hallmark I'd been schooled to identify. An advanced, delayed reaction mixture meant to cause heart failure, a demise that would appear sadly ordinary. My pulse chilled, my stare fixed on my mother. She maintained her smile, a calm, peaceful look that failed to thaw the icy depth of her gaze. She was aware. The surroundings started to spin. My sight fogged, the dazzling light fixture shattering into countless fragmented gleams. The lavish dining space rocked, and my parents' words grew warped, as though submerged. But I caught the phrases. I absorbed each one. Victoria's tone, devoid of facade, was as frigid and piercing as a blade. She was never our daughter, Reginald. She was a burden, a minor flaw in our heritage. Her voice was detached, businesslike, akin to evaluating a poor asset, and it's time to eliminate her. My father remained mute. His quiet was thunderous. It was his endorsement of my execution. They weren't merely poisoning me, they were disposing of a liability. My form collapsed. I fell ahead, my limb toppling the wine goblet. The screaming eagle, scarlet as lifeblood, spread over the pristine tablecloth, a brutal blemish on an immaculate surface. The final vision etched into my consciousness was of my mother, a tranquil grin on her lips as she methodically, intentionally donned a pair of elegant ivory silk gloves. She was prepared to tidy the chaos that was me. But as shadows engulfed me, another voice resounded in the crumbling passages of my thoughts. It was the mantra of my mentors at headquarters, ingrained in my core. Evaluate threats, secure surroundings, endure, retaliate. They assumed this was the conclusion. They believed they could effortlessly discard me. They were mistaken. This was the start. In the advancing gloom, my thoughts wandered. The toxin drew me deeper. But rather than void, it hauled me through my private gallery of wounds, each display a proof of a prolonged and meticulously recorded disloyalty. The initial recollection to emerge was from age 14. It carried the scent of soldering flux and engine lubricant. I had secured top honors at the regional science competition. My creation, a self-operating mechanical limb I'd constructed from basics, had consumed my life for months. I'd endured endless evenings in the workshop, my fingers smeared with oil and minor scorches from the tool, my brain buzzing with drive. I returned that afternoon grasping the substantial gold-plated award, my pulse racing with a youthful thrill I hadn't yet mastered hiding. I encountered my mother in the parlor organizing blooms. She eyed the award, then my oil-marked pants, and her elegantly shaped mouth pursed in disapproval. "Bethany," she remarked, her tone laced with letdown, "a Montgomery lady shouldn't tamper with grimy gadgets. You appear disheveled." That evening, a festive meal occurred at the yacht club. Not in my honor. It celebrated Ethan, who had recently joined the elite soccer squad. My award was discreetly positioned on a lower rack in my father's extensive study, obscured by a set of bound reference volumes. In days, it accumulated dust, an overlooked tribute to a success that clashed with the family story. I absorbed a crucial insight. My triumphs were solitary, to be savored privately. The shadows churned, and a different memory arose. I was 15. The evening breeze was chilly, redolent of precipitation and the sharp odor of scorched tires. Ethan, intoxicated and careless at the helm of his fresh Mercedes, had collided with another vehicle, inflicting slight harm on the other motorist. I occupied the adjacent seat, the lone observer. My father showed up prior to law enforcement, his expression a veil of restrained anger. He ignored the injured party. He drew me aside, his clutch on my limb like iron. "You'll claim you were operating it," he whispered fiercely, his words hushed and pressing. "You're underage. It'll be minor consequences. Ethan's history must stay spotless. He can't afford this." Something within me fractured. "No," I declared, the term feeling alien and potent. "I refuse." He glared at me, his eyes brimming with a stark, unyielding animosity I'd never witnessed. "Your obstinacy," he snarled, "will destroy this household." He wasn't referring to the crash. He meant me. I wasn't demolishing the family. I was simply declining to perpetuate its deceptions. That evening I turned into an opponent. The concluding display in the gallery was the most agonizing. I was 16. It was the event that didn't merely strain the limits, it obliterated them. Ethan, confronting a poor mark in his advanced literature course, pilfered a paper from my laptop and turned it in as his. When the instructor, familiar with my style, uncovered the copying, Ethan didn't admit fault. He alleged I had sabotaged him from resentment, that I'd infiltrated his account and submitted it to incriminate him. Victoria trusted him instantly. She accosted me in my chamber, her frame quaking with a fury that was alarming to witness. "You are a serpent in this residence," she yelled, her voice trembling. "You are riddled with jealousy toward your brother." Then she performed an act I'd always remember. She seized my birth record from my bureau compartment, dangled it before me, and shredded it apart. The rip of paper echoed louder than her shouts. "I regret your existence," she wailed, the fragments drifting to the ground like withered foliage. My father lingered in the entrance, a wordless observer to my demise. Once my mother's outburst waned, he uttered one subdued phrase. "Depart before you cause further harm." That was all. No hearing, no rebuttal. I was convicted. I gathered a lone backpack that night and exited the residence. The ripped shards of my essence still strewn on the rug. I was unseen, a specter in my own abode, and now I was being banished. As I proceeded along the extended curving path toward the stark metal barriers, a gentle, creased palm grasped my arm. It was Mrs. Wilkins. In the dim shine of the veranda lamp, I noticed tears cascading down her face. She thrust a modest bundle of bills and a quickly assembled snack into my grasp. "Leave, dear child," she murmured, her tone heavy with feeling. "Leave and forge an existence for yourself. A genuine one. This location, it isn't worthy of you." It was the singular gesture of compassion I encountered that night. A faint glimmering light in the storm of treachery. For years, the recollection of her tender touch was the only element that prevented me from accepting I was entirely and utterly valueless. It was my evidence that I had once mattered. An abrupt, harsh intake of breath returned me to now. The odor of moist soil and mildew permeated my senses. I was no longer in the dining area. I was in the wine vault. My agency preparation activated at once, an automatic response superseding the haze of the substance. Evaluate, align, resolve, execute. I conducted a swift cognitive and bodily check. No evident wounds, yet my appendages felt weighted. My ideas lethargic. No armaments, no contact tools. They had divested me thoroughly. They had hauled my limp form down here, intending to orchestrate what? A vanishing? A mishap? They had abandoned me as deceased. But then I noticed it. On a tiny, grimy timber box next to me rested a single dragonfly-shaped brooch. My brooch. They must have detached it during transport. A oversight. An error. A deadly one. They were careless. They were overconfident. They assumed they had eradicated a domestic issue, a troublesome offspring who had exceeded her purpose. A frigid, keen lucidity sliced through the remaining effects of the compound. I surveyed the dim, humid vault, at the shelves of invaluable vintages, standing mute guardians. I reflected on the girl who triumphed at the science contest, the girl who declined to deceive, the girl who was expelled into the darkness with naught but a backpack. And I pondered, did they truly believe I remained that 16-year-old? Had they overlooked the sort of existence they hurled me into? They had flung me into reality, and reality had been merciless. After departing Woodside with the scant funds Mrs. Wilkins had provided, I escaped to the vast, nameless urban sprawl of San Diego. I discovered the harsh truth that endurance demands a high toll. My initial weeks were a haze of resting on public seats in Balboa Park and lodging in dingy inns that reeked of musty despair. I experienced the acute, persistent pang of true starvation, a sensation completely unfamiliar to the child raised on gourmet feasts. I accepted any employment available. I scrubbed plates in a scorching Italian eatery in Little Italy. My palms chafed and sore. I sanitized restrooms at a film lot in Carlsbad, unnoticed by the elegant figures who hurried by. It was there, on my knees polishing a surface, that I looked up at a display screen in the foyer and saw her. My mother, Victoria Montgomery, at a fundraising event, illuminated by the gentle radiance of camera flashes. She was giving a talk on empathy and societal duty, her words echoing with insincere earnestness. The ticker below proclaimed she had donated $3 million to the initiative. She was contributing fortunes to rescue society while her own child, distances away, pondered if a slice of bread showing initial mold was edible. The sight of her impeccable, gracious smile on that monitor was the deepest shame I'd ever suffered. It wasn't merely that they had ejected me, it was that they had erased me so thoroughly. That season, I almost shattered. One evening, a fierce downpour ravaged the region. I was drenched through, trembling fiercely beneath the thin overhang of a shuttered shop, the chill penetrating my core. I was famished, drained, and totally isolated. For the first time, I contemplated surrender, just releasing. That's when an elderly gentleman materialized amid the pouring sheets. He was sturdy and rugged, bearing the distinct bearing of a retired soldier. He owned a modest, rugged martial arts dojo adjacent. He posed no inquiries, extended no sympathy. He merely offered an umbrella and a hot foam container of broth from a local cafe. "You seem like a warrior," he stated, his voice a deep, raspy growl. "You simply haven't discovered your battle yet." His statement and the straightforward, unreserved kindness jolted my being like a revival. He perceived a combatant where I saw only a casualty. The following day, I spent my final $20 on a transit pass and entered an enlistment center. If I lacked a kin, I'd gain a squad. If I lacked affection, I'd gain order. If existence was combat, I'd become a soldier. The armed forces provided framework, aim, and an escape. My smarts and a freshly unearthed fierce stamina drew attention. Several years on, I stood at the entrance of the ranch in Virginia, dubbed the farm by insiders, the CIA's fabled preparation site. The farm aimed to dismantle you and reconstruct you as a tool. They divest you of all: your identity, your history, your flaws, your feelings. They instruct you to deceive without a racing heart, to endure savage questioning methods, to convert your physique and intellect into armaments. The regimen was a unique torment, but for me, it was also refuge. I directed my anguish. In intense close-quarters fighting exercises, my foe's visage morphed into Ethan's during mental resilience evaluations. When trainers bellowed degradations to shatter my resolve, I ignored them. I heard Victoria's tone labeling me a serpent, a failure. My kin had supplied me with a lifetime of unsanctioned preparation for this venue. They had transformed my suffering into my prime strength. I completed as the best in my group. I mastered vanishing amid masses, how to discern a person's motives in the twitch of their gaze, how to persist in an adversarial metropolis with only my attire. I evolved into a phantom, a field agent, an implement of the federal authority. Yet beneath, my drive wasn't unthinking loyalty, it was perseverance. Each ability I gained, each dialect I commanded was an additional layer in the barrier I erected around my spirit. They schooled me to sense nothing when required. It was the utmost boon and the harshest affliction they could bestow. And now, positioned in the chilly, moist wine vault of the Montgomery mansion, I at last comprehended my authentic legacy. It wasn't equities or properties or a title that unlocked opportunities. My legacy was the marks, the toughness, the deadly quiet I could unleash freely. My father had erected a domain of metal and explosives. I had forged myself from remnants and disloyalty. I examined my palms, no longer delicate and groomed, but roughened and proficient. I considered theirs, my father's, authorizing packs, my mother's donning silk gloves, and I questioned whose armaments held greater might. It was time to ascertain. Employing the dragonfly brooch from the vault, I manipulated the latch on a seldom-used utility exit and escaped into the early morning hush of Woodside. I appropriated a vehicle from the extended parking at an adjacent golf resort and headed east, the distance forging a vitally required separation between me and that dwelling. I located an inexpensive lodge in Oakland, a spot of flaking walls and fleeting figures, and settled with currency. Solitary in the stuffy chamber, the rush ebbed, yielding a deep, profound solitude. There was solely one individual worldwide I could rely on. Via a disposable device I'd acquired at a fuel stop, I activated a crisis outreach method I'd hoped never to employ. Through an intricately secured system, I transmitted one encoded term to one contact, breached. The contact was a gentleman named Marco, alias Phantom. He was the veteran handler who had enlisted me, a mythic figure in the agency, who had not merely outlasted the East-West tensions, but flourished in the covert skirmishes thereafter. To much of the organization, he was invisible. To me, he was the sole person who had ever genuinely perceived me. The disposable device buzzed precisely 10 minutes afterward. I responded, my pulse thumping in my chest. "Clark, status update." Marco's tone emerged, composed and firm, completely absent of alarm. He sounded like I was just reporting on the climate in the Bay Area. My own tone wavered, but I compelled it into the concise, exact rhythm of an operational briefing. Sedated, confined, attempted assassination. Culprits are my natural relatives. There was no delay on the line, no trace of skepticism, merely serene acknowledgement. "Comprehended," he replied. "Safe haven measures are engaged. Secure a protected spot and remain concealed. I'll manage the logistics from this side." He halted, and then his tone gentled subtly. "You have support." Those 4 terms struck me more forcefully than any strike. You have support. For a dozen years, from the evening I departed that dwelling with a backpack, I had been absolutely and totally isolated. For the first time, in a budget lodge chamber reeking of old smoke. That ceased to be fact. I possessed a comrade. I possessed reinforcement. My thoughts overflowed with recollections of Marco. He wasn't merely the instructor who showed me to install a surveillance gadget or free myself from restraints using a fastener. He was the one who remained with me in a barren review space post my debut assignment in Lima, where I'd seen atrocities that still plagued my dreams. He hadn't provided hollow reassurances or urged resilience. He had quietly prepared a mug of chamomile tea, the variety he recalled I preferred, and placed it before me. "The anguish is inherent to the role, Clark," he had stated, his look steady and insightful. "How we bear it shapes us." He guided me to mold that anguish into protection rather than allowing it to form a prison. He recognized the spark in me, the endurance spawned from my broken history, and he trusted it could serve positively. In the realm of espionage, suspicion is a vital trait. You rely on none. Yet Marco relied on me fully and without reservation. He sought no evidence or doubted my account. He understood me. He recognized the honor I had battled fiercely to construct from the debris of my youth. His steadfast faith was a potent remedy to the decades of charges and scorn I'd withstood. It was a rescue line affirming that an individual's value isn't set by the kin they inherit, but by those who elect to ally with them. He was my selected kin. A protected dispatch arrived on the disposable device 60 minutes later. Marco had arranged a provisional fresh persona for me, untraceable funding, and a brief assembled roster of reliable contacts along the Pacific shore. "This is your conflict, Clark," the dispatch stated, "but you'll be equipped. Deploy these assets judiciously." I gazed at the roster. My preparation had endowed me with the talents of a specter. But this roster granted the specter clause. The initial entry was Priya Patel, a formidable lawyer in Los Angeles, famed for confronting and dismantling huge enterprises. I inhaled deeply, sensing the comfort of that unseen aid from afar. It was a guard, a commitment. I was no longer a prey hiding in obscurity. I was an operative with an objective. I grasped the device. My retaliation had commenced. Priya Patel's workspace was in a modern skyscraper in Los Angeles's business hub, a domain of crystal and metal that seemed worlds distant from the obscurity I navigated. The panorama from her expansive panes was a breathtaking vista of the ocean, a setting of authority and sway. Priya, a keen, imposing lady of South Asian heritage, donned a custom Armani ensemble like armor. Her gaze was astute and penetrating, and as I detailed the events, the sedation, the vault, the getaway, they overlooked naught. She proffered no syllable of compassion or solace. She absorbed with the fierce concentration of a hunter. "They think you're gone," she affirmed upon my conclusion, her manner sharp and logical. It wasn't an inquiry. That affords us the advantage of ambush. And to clarify, Bethany, we aren't pursuing for psychological trauma. That's feeble, and it's what they'd predict. We are targeting them for serious deceit, plot to kill, and deliberate causation of injury. We will shatter their standing and assault the sole element they genuinely cherish, their wealth. Her cool, strategic expertise was a salve to my strained psyche. This wasn't a domestic saga anymore. It was a campaign. As Priya's crew of eager junior aides initiated an in-depth probe into the Montgomery clan's intricate holdings, the initial fracture in the veneer surfaced in 2 days. They revealed an earlier edition of the Montgomery Lineage Trust, one that explicitly named me, Bethany Montgomery, as a 1/3 inheritor, the name I carried before I became Clark. Then they located the revision. Half a year prior, my designation had evaporated. My full portion of the estate that could have permitted me to vanish and exist luxuriously forever had been silently reallocated to my sibling Ethan. The altered record had been formally submitted merely 3 weeks before Montgomery Security openly revealed a groundbreaking $6 billion weaponry pact with a Southeast Asian country infamous for its abuses. Priya pushed a reproduced section from the pact across her broad walnut workspace. I perused the impersonal business jargon. A vital stipulation mandated the Leadership Council of Montgomery Security to exhibit absolute and indisputable steadiness, devoid of any existing or imminent kin disputes that might endanger safety or corporate reputation. She regarded me, her acute eyes capturing mine. "They didn't merely reject you, Bethany. They erased you. You were a possible kin conflict that could have threatened the agreement. They traded you for a pact." The terms lingered in the atmosphere, frigid and weighty. I wasn't offspring. I was a balance sheet entry that had been expunged to seal a transaction. While Priya assaulted the monetary angle, I handled the evidential side. Marco's roster directed me to Jack Harlan, a brusque yet ingenious ex-FAA examiner who now operated as an independent advisor. We convened close to the serene forested path where my kin had fabricated my vanishing. They had positioned my leased car smashed into a trunk, a setup crafted to suggest I'd fled in distress after a solo crash. Jack inspected the area with a seasoned, skeptical glance. He was a fellow who held that every incident told a tale. "And this one," he muttered, "was utter fabrication." "Safety bag activated before collision," he growled, indicating the readings he'd extracted from the vehicle's recorder. Somebody initiated it from afar. Novice work. He then displayed a tiny container holding a specimen of the fluid they'd daubed on the wheel. "And this fluid? It's not yours. I compared the genetics to a specimen you supplied. It's a total discrepancy, likely from an anonymous donor via a lab supplier." Their hubris was offensive. They assumed a wrecked vehicle and a phony blood smear would suffice to obliterate a CIA agent. They had no clue about the force they were confronting. The concluding element of the regional enigma emerged from a blurry surveillance recording at a round-the-clock convenience mart about half a mile from the collision location. The video was marked with a timestamp merely 7 minutes following the emergency call about the incident. A silhouette in a shadowy sweatshirt stepped out from the forest, anxiously scanning the area before hastily climbing into a dark SUV that had been idling with its headlights dimmed. As the figure pivoted to enter, the stark artificial glow from the shop lit up his features for one incriminating instant. Ethan, my brother, the clan's favored son, the impeccably groomed successor, was the boots-on-the-ground executor. He was the one who had sanitized the car, applied the blood, and dashed off into the darkness. This disloyalty in its pitiful, timid performance somehow wounded more deeply than my mother's ruthless directive. But the greatest revelation was still ahead. Back in the musty atmosphere of my lodge chamber, I employed my protected access codes and a satellite connection to reach the CIA's confidential databases. I simply required my assignment records from Ecuador, my unassailable cover. The display blinked an outcome that chilled me to the core. Entry refused. Information absent. My complete mission dossier from that period, every login, every update, had been purged, erased entirely. My disposable device chimed. It was Marco. For the initial occasion since I'd met him, I detected a hint of real strain in his tone. "Clark, we've got an issue. A major one." That removal command didn't originate from within the organization. It was channeled via a top-tier server at Montgomery Security, employing a secret access point that virtually nobody is aware of. A icy terror lodged in my gut. This was inconceivable. "Your father isn't merely a weapons merchant," Marco went on, his tone somber and hushed. "He's penetrated profoundly. This isn't a domestic affair anymore, Bethany. This has escalated to a concern of homeland defense." Marco's phrase, "a concern of homeland defense," struck me like a tangible impact. The revelation that my cover had been expunged from CIA systems wasn't merely a setback. It was a grave infringement. The organization wasn't just my boss. It was my haven, the sole entity on the planet where I sensed I fit, where my abilities were appreciated, where my history was irrelevant. They had seized the one untainted aspect of my existence and tainted it with their grime. They had extended their corrupt business fingers into the core of headquarters and converted the Central Intelligence Agency into an instrument to conceal a sordid kin offense. The anger that flared within me was no longer a gradual smolder. It was an atomic explosion. They had violated every imaginable boundary. They didn't simply aim to end me. They sought to annul my very being, to expunge the decades of duty I had rendered to my nation, as though they had never occurred. I staggered into the budget lodge restroom and gazed at my image in the fractured glass. But I didn't perceive my own visage. I saw my father's arrogant and swollen with authority. I saw my mother's tranquil, psychopathic grin. I saw Ethan's vacant, spineless stare. They had stripped everything from me, my kin, my identity, my background, and now my dignity as an operative. The ultimate restraint broke. The barrier of control that had required years to erect splintered into countless fragments. The era for protection was finished. The era for endurance was finished. Now it was the era to assault. My fingers clenched the rims of the ceramic basin, my joints paling. A pledge crystallized in my thoughts, not in phrases, but in frigid, solid metal. It was an oath tempered in the flames of total disloyalty. "You crafted me into a tool," I murmured to the image, my tone a subdued, perilous growl. "You instructed me to pursue in the shadows. You instructed me to capitalize on vulnerabilities, to lay ambushes, to bide for the ideal instant to pounce. You fashioned this beast to fulfill your objectives." I inclined nearer, my gaze fixing on the unfamiliar figure in the reflection, and now this beast has returned to its origins. I retrieved the disposable device. My fingers were impeccably firm now. The fury had solidified into something much more perilous. resolve. I contacted Marco. He responded immediately. Clark, Phantom, I require something. I stated, my tone lacking feeling. Something unofficial. There was an extended silence on the line. I could sense him evaluating the dangers, the ramifications. Proceed, Clark. I need the present alias and whereabouts of Frederick Hayes, ex-chief accountant for Montgomery Security. The formal account claims he perished in a vehicular mishap 5 years back. I don't accept it. This was an enormous demand. Employing organization assets for a private grudge could result in me in a government penitentiary. It was a threshold I had never envisioned breaching, but they had pulled the organization into this. They had rendered it a matter of homeland defense. Now I would leverage that to my benefit. Marco was quiet for another instant. He comprehended. I'll investigate what I can achieve, he replied at last. But exercise caution, Bethany. The route you're pursuing now, there's no reversal. I understand, I said. I'm not intending on it. While awaiting Marco, I executed another maneuver, one that was debatably even more hazardous. Utilizing a multi-tiered concealment method I'd acquired at the ranch, I dispatched an undetectable text to a firm device owned by a lady named Sarah Klein. She was an intermediate-level records keeper at Montgomery Security. Her dad, a talented technician, had been a Montgomery worker who had succumbed to an abrupt cardiac event years prior, soon after being maligned for voicing worries about a drone navigation mechanism. The note was straightforward, just one line crafted to sow a kernel of skepticism in receptive terrain. They fabricated your father's demise, and they're fabricating far more. I realize some of you tuning in might consider this imprudent, a risk I shouldn't have embraced. But I must inquire of you, when you've been forced into a tight spot with nothing remaining to forfeit, wouldn't you seize an opportunity? Wouldn't you wager on the single individual who might grasp what it's like to have their kin's dignity demolished by the identical folks? I didn't know her response. She could alert authorities. She could disregard it. But in an uneven battle against a colossus, you don't prevail with raw power. You prevail by forging comrades in the most unforeseen locales. I had just ignited a detonator deep within the core of the Montgomery Dominion. Now all I needed was to await its combustion. A couple of hours post my inquiry, a coded dispatch from Marco materialized on the disposable device. It was concise and direct. Hayes surviving. Pseudonym in Ashland, Oregon. Positions enclosed. Utmost vigilance recommended. Individual is suspicious and equipped. I didn't waver. I traveled through the evening, urging the appropriated car over the barren roadways of the Pacific Seaboard. Ashland, Oregon, a modest community tucked in the shade of the Siskiyou Mountains, was the ideal spot for a deceased man to conceal. Adhering to the positions, I located Frederick Hayes' lodge far in the timber, secluded and fortified. A slender plume of vapor ascending from the flue was an indicator of existence, but also an indicator of reinforcement. This was not a man who embraced callers. I couldn't execute a straightforward advance. I devoted hours scrutinizing the lodge from afar, my operational preparation dominating. I dissected his schedules, his routines. He was a being of pattern, and one of those patterns was bearing a compact firearm. Strapped to his waist, even during mere wood splitting, I bided until he was outdoors, his rear to the thick forest. I advanced noiselessly, nearing from his unseen angle, and uttered from the foliage border, my tone serene and subdued. Frederick Hayes, I'm not affiliated with Montgomery. He whirled in a flash, the weapon in his grasp, and aimed at my torso before I could react. Who are you? He grated, his tone rough from neglect. I elevated my palms gradually, demonstrating they were vacant. My name is Bethany Clark, I said, maintaining my tone balanced. I'm the daughter Reginald Montgomery attempted to eliminate last week. His eyes, constricted with dread and mistrust, wavered. The dread didn't dissipate, but a fresh sentiment accompanied it. Fatigued, urgent inquisitiveness. He dropped the weapon slightly. Enter, he ordered. The atmosphere within the compact lodge was dense with the odor of old brew, timber haze, and decades of bitterness. The partitions were a disordered mosaic, a temple to his fixation. Economic graphs, periodical excerpts of Montgomery Securities' victories, and scrawled, distrustful memos were affixed all over. This wasn't a residence, it was a headquarters for a solo crusade. Frederick narrated his tale. As the primary accountant, he had uncovered a multi-million-dollar secret account utilized by the Montgomerys to corrupt international dignitaries and mask disastrous armaments evaluations. When he was gearing up to expose it, they had orchestrated a vehicular mishap. They ended in blameless individual, a vagrant, and affixed my credentials to the corpse, Frederick stated, his tone quivering with an indignation he'd been cultivating for 5 years. They annulled me. He had been existing in this voluntary confinement since, tormented by the dominion that had ruined him. He was a phantom akin to me. I can safeguard you, I said, my tone resolute. I can restore your existence, but I require your armaments. Frederick gazed at me for an extended period, his eyes probing mine for any trace of duplicity. At last, he appeared to decide. He proceeded to an ancient sturdy metal trunk, unfastened it, and extracted a compact digital sound device. I installed this in Reginald's confidential meeting space the day prior to my demise, he said, his palm trembling mildly as he extended it. It's sound-triggered. It captured all. He activated it. A voice, refined and eerily recognizable, permeated the modest lodge. It was Victoria's. The woman is the final unresolved issue. Remove the burden. All will be concealed. Then emerged Reginald's voice, conferring with his counselors on managing Ethan's assorted judicial issues, including a fresh detention in Brazil, discreetly and irrevocably. It was all present. The scheme, the incentive, the complete absence of ethics. It was the definitive proof. When I reverted to my lodge in Oakland, another component of the enigma awaited. A coded electronic mail had come from an unfamiliar source. The originator was Sarah Klein. I trust you. The dispatch commenced. My dad committed his existence to Montgomery Security when he unearthed a lethal construction defect in a novel drone setup. They dismissed him and labeled him a betrayer. He succumbed to a cardiac event a few months afterward. My mom always claimed he perished from a shattered spirit. I will aid you. Inform me what you necessitate. My wager had succeeded. I transmitted her a protected response soliciting 2 items from the Montgomery judicial records: the confidential logs of Ethan's detention in Brazil and the initial unaltered edition of the Montgomery Kin Trust record. An hour subsequently, the documents were in my mailbox. I possessed it all. The trust fund deceit, the fabricated mishap, Ethan's offense history, and the sound capture of my own execution order being mandated. I regarded the heap of proof on my portable screen. My comrades were the phantoms of my kin's making, a maligned accountant, a deceased technician's offspring, and me. Frederick had been accurate. It was time for the phantoms to articulate. The Alameda County Superior Court was a stage of authority, and on this occasion it was fully attended. The refined timber seats were crowded. Reporters eager for the controversy were squeezed into the media section, writing instruments ready. Competing lawyers, detecting vulnerability, were dispersed amid the assembly. And naturally, there were the denizens of Woodside elite circles, a group of scavengers in couture attire, all keen to observe the intimate turmoil of the ostensibly flawless Montgomery kin erupt into communal spectacle. I positioned beside Priya, a motionless, serene hub in the whirling maelstrom of my own design. Opposite the chamber, my kin claimed the foremost row as if it were a regal enclosure. They were an ideal depiction of inaccessible affluence and haughtiness. Victoria was flawless in a snowy Versace ensemble, her demeanor one of disinterested outrage, as if she were compelled to tolerate a dreadfully ordinary public obligation. Reginald appeared imposing and stern, the magnate of commerce unjustly troubled by a minor matter, and Ethan. Ethan merely seemed disinterested, casually browsing his device, an image of entitled apathy. Their chief counsel, a smooth enterprise hunter named Ryan Voss, exuded a greasy assurance. They weren't simply convinced they would triumph. The notion of defeat hadn't even dawned on them. When Priya Patel ascended to address, her aura composed and authoritative, Voss promptly leaped up to interrupt her. "Your Honor," he started with a disdainful smirk, "this is a frantic and honestly lamentable effort by a resentful, erratic daughter to coerce funds from her affectionate kin. There is no matter here, only an extortion. We request prompt rejection." The magistrate, a lady in her late 60s, named Judge Rose Fletcher, was renowned for her astute intellect and straightforward attitude. She glanced at Voss over her spectacles, her look inscrutable. "Mr. Voss," she said, her tone soft, but bearing the gravity of total command. "This is my tribunal. You will utter when I permit you. For now, be seated. Allow Miss Patel to proceed." Priya offered a minor inclination of recognition and directed to the sizable display panel behind her. The initial assault was imminent. "Your Honor, the opposition asserts my client, Bethany Clark, was engaged in a solo vehicle collision on the evening of November 15th, after which she allegedly escaped. Nevertheless, we possess here a somewhat unclassified assignment record from the Central Intelligence Agency. The file, extensively censored but with crucial parts readable, occupied the display. This record confirms that on that date, Operative Bethany Clark was actually performing a delicate homeland defense mission for the American administration in Ecuador. A subdued buzz coursed through the tribunal, as if prompted. A lateral entrance parted, and a severe-appearing gentleman in a somber traditional outfit stepped in. He neared the dais and in a ceremonial manner declared himself as an emissary from the CIA's Bureau of the Overseer General. He officially validated the file for the tribunal. The ambiance in the space altered noticeably. I observed my kin. Voss appeared disconcerted for the first occasion, his conceited assurance wavering. Reginald's forehead creased, his look solidifying from irritation to worry. Victoria stayed unmoved, an impeccable stone effigy of poise, but I noticed her palm, decorated with an enormous sapphire, clench on her lavish Birkin purse. Priya permitted the instant to suspend in the atmosphere, enabling the inference to embed before administering the second, more savage strike. "And now, Your Honor," she said, her tone echoing with dramatic serenity, "we wish to broadcast a segment of sound for the tribunal." She pressed a key on her portable. A voice, distinct and sharp, permeated the hushed tribunal. It was sophisticated, refined, and completely chilling. It was Victoria's. "Place the brooch in the compartment. It's an intimate detail. No fluid, no injury. It will appear as a slight mishap, we'll claim." The woman panicked and fled. A unified inhalation swept the observers. The reporters commenced jotting rapidly. I glanced at my mother. Her visage, for the initial time in my whole existence, was a facade of sheer, unaltered astonishment. Her impeccable poise at last savagely fractured. Voss leaped up, his countenance flushed. "Objection, Your Honor. This capture is entirely unacceptable. It was evidently acquired unlawfully." Judge Fletcher's mallet descended with a keen, definitive snap that muted him. "Objection denied, advisor. As I'm certain you're informed, this is the initial session, not a panel proceeding. The tribunal will listen now, for the final occasion. Be seated." Priya awaited the space to hush once more. She was a maestro directing their communal demise. "Your Honor," she said, her tone now resounding with potency, "the accusation wishes to summon its subsequent testifier to the platform, Mr. Frederick Hayes." The designation signified naught to most in the space, but to my father it was a fatal spike. The principal portals of the tribunal parted. A gentleman in a neat but outdated ensemble, his countenance pallid but resolute, advanced steadily along the passageway. It was Frederick. A monumental tremor surged through the space. The media section burst into a whirl of motion. Reginald surged to his feet, his countenance void of hue until it was ashen. "No," he faltered, his tone a choked murmur. "It can't be." Frederick Hayes ascended the witness platform, was affirmed, and then directed his gaze straight to my father, who remained upright, immobilized in incredulity. "Hello, Reginald," Frederick said, his tone distinct and firm. "It's been an interval." That was the instant the Montgomery Dominion genuinely commenced to disintegrate. Over the ensuing hour, Frederick systematically and serenely elaborated all. The secret account, the corruption, the concealments of botched armaments assessments. He narrated how Reginald Montgomery had individually mandated the simulated vehicular mishap that was intended to have terminated him. He supplied ledger digits, timelines, and designations, interlacing a fabric of deceit so expansive and complex, it rendered the tribunal speechless. By the time he concluded, the space was in total disarray. Voss was desperately attempting to protest, to undermine, to perform anything, but it was akin to mending a barrier with adhesive. The judge's mallet struck repeatedly, a frantic bid to reinstate a modicum of discipline. When tranquility ultimately resumed, she regarded my kin directly. Her eyes were shards of frost, lacking any pity or empathy. "Grounded on the overpowering proof exhibited in this session," she proclaimed, her tone echoing with the irrevocability of a demise verdict, "this tribunal deems adequate reason to mandate and prompt penal probe into Reginald Montgomery, Victoria Montgomery, and Ethan Montgomery on accusations encompassing but not confined to serious deceit, scheme, and attempted homicide." She regarded each of them sequentially, her gaze pausing for a moment on my mother's demolished, appalled demeanor. "This session is terminated." Her ultimate mallet blow resounded through the muted tribunal like a firearm discharge, the noise that would eternally signify the conclusion of the prolonged and fraudulent dominion of the Montgomery lineage. The repercussions from the session were rapid and savage. The reports disseminated like conflagration through the economic sphere. Montgomery Security shares plunged, turning valueless instantaneously. The Defense Department promptly halted all current agreements and initiated a comprehensive inquiry. The press labeled it the armament sector's Enron, a dramatic collapse of avarice and deceit. From my nameless inn-chamber, I observed the dominion my father had erected on a base of fabrications and brutality reduced to cinders on the nightly broadcasts. I had anticipated sensing a feeling of elation, of success. Instead, there was merely an immense frigid void. I had prevailed, but the cost of prevailing was all. I had 3 concluding unresolved matters to resolve. The initial was Ethan. I encountered him at the national incarceration where he was detained. He donned a regulation orange garment that draped loosely on his now emaciated build. The favored sun radiance had been quenched, leaving a vacant, pitiful husk. He raised his head as I positioned across from him, a dense sheet of acrylic separating us. "Bethany," he said, his tone a feeble wheeze through the intercom. "I'm remorseful." I regarded him, not with loathing, but with a deep and exhausted compassion. "No, you're not, Ethan," I said, my tone steady and uniform. "You're not remorseful for what you executed. You're solely remorseful you were apprehended." I permitted the verity of that to linger in the barren atmosphere between us. "You never perceived me as a sibling. I was merely a barrier in your trajectory." Another dilemma for father to resolve. "Farewell, Ethan." I arose and departed without glancing rearward, abandoning him to the 25-year term he had merited, and to the empty verity that he had penned his own ruin. My second encounter was with my father. Reginald had endured a minor cerebral event post the session, and was now dwelling in a premium extended care establishment facing the ocean. I discovered him seated in a mobility chair by a broad pane, gazing out at the sea, a monarch inspecting his forfeited realm. He didn't pivot or recognize me when I accessed the space. His formerly dominating aura had contracted into a delicate muteness. On the surface beside him, I positioned the antique silver compass he had borne for years, its metallic shell polished even. "You possessed a selection," I said gently. More to myself than to him. You had an opportunity to be a parent. You opted to be an executive instead. I halted, awaiting a reply that I knew would never arrive. I hope it was valuable. He stayed mute, his gaze anchored on the vista. His muteness was no longer a tool of involvement. It was the barren, ultimate muteness of total vanquishment. I departed, sealing that segment of my existence permanently. The most challenging clash was the final. Victoria was under domicile confinement in the Woodside Manor, now a frigid vacant tomb, resounding with her defeats. When she beheld me, her eyes, once so frigid and restrained, were feral with a frenzied, trapped wrath. "You!" she screeched, her tone harsh. "You've devastated all. You were always a blight on this kin." I regarded her positioned amid the debris of her impeccable existence, and I sensed nothing but a remote medical separation. "No, Mrs. Montgomery," I said, my tone subdued but resolute. "I'm not the blight. I am the outcome of your decisions." I maintained her deranged gaze. "You instructed me that in this realm only the resilient persist. You instructed me that emotion is a frailty, and that all that counts is prevailing." I offered her a minor, frigid grin, and I absorbed the instruction thoroughly. So gratitude for the tutelage. I pivoted and exited the dwelling for the ultimate occasion, her cries of fury and rejection diminishing behind me until they were nothing but a faint, pitiful resonance. That evening, I positioned on the terrace of my inn chamber, surveying the sparkling spread of Los Angeles. The conflict was concluded. I had triumphed. I had equity. I had obliterated the individuals who attempted to obliterate me. But after all of it, a query persisted in the abrupt, alarming quiet. Who was I now? I was no longer a Montgomery. I was no longer an operational agent functioning in the obscurity. For the initial time in my mature existence, I was wholly and completely liberated. And that liberation was both thrilling and alarming. The query was no longer how to endure. It was how to exist. 2 weeks post my ultimate trip to Woodside, I tendered my departure from the CIA. Marco managed all discreetly, guaranteeing my exit was pristine and definitive. In our concluding gathering, a poignant adieu in a serene Maryland eatery, he pushed a modest packet across the surface. Within was a fresh travel document with a novel designation and a blank canvas. "You've rendered this nation with distinction, Clark," he said, his eyes benevolent. "Now it's time to render yourself." I expressed gratitude to him, my guide, my selected kin, the sole paternal figure I had ever recognized. As I traveled away from headquarters for the ultimate occasion, I sensed as though I were discarding an aged layer. The burden of being Bethany Clark, CIA operative, and Bethany Montgomery, undesired offspring, ultimately elevated. I was no longer an intelligence agent. I was no longer a casualty. I was merely a lady seeking a locale to term home. I discovered home in the most improbable of locales, a modest timber lodge on the brink of an iced pond in Vermont. The seasons here were extended and merciless, but the deep quiet of the frost-blanketed terrain was profoundly restorative. The query that had tormented me in Los Angeles, how to exist, commenced to uncover its solutions here. I devoted my days reacquiring how to be an individual instead of a tool. I perused volumes not for data collection, but for the elegance of the terms. I rediscovered the transcendentalists, their doctrines on environment and independence echoing with my own quest for serenity. I initiated a modest interior plot, acquiring the straightforward anchoring delight of sensing the earth beneath my nails. And one day, I traveled to a regional creature refuge and embraced a silly oversized Labrador with melancholic eyes. I titled him Wilkins, a subdued homage to the sole individual in that frigid woodside dwelling who had ever displayed me an instant of unadulterated compassion. A few months into my novel existence, a modest parcel arrived from Marco. Within was my father's antique silver compass. Nestled beside it was a minor scripted memo on dense stationery. "Your heritage isn't what they bequeathed you." It perused, "It's what you withstood." I grasped the compass in my palm, its acquainted mass, a specter from another existence. For an instant, I was enticed to unveil it to observe the needle. Instead, I positioned it within an aged timber container and placed it on the uppermost ledge of a storage. The history was a component of my narrative, but it would no longer delineate my destiny. My heritage would be inscribed in the subdued, tranquil days to arrive, not in the blazes I had traversed. Restoration, I acquired, is not a direct path. There were evenings I still awoke with my pulse racing, the spectral sensation of a combat or escape reaction surging through me. There were days when the quiet of the lodge felt less like serenity and more like oppressive isolation. But I persisted, reverting to something the thinker Viktor Frankl once penned. When we are no longer capable to alter a circumstance, we are tested to alter ourselves. I couldn't modify the disloyalties, the brutality, the years of sensing insignificant, but I could modify how I permitted them to impact my current. I acquired to inhale through the instants of alarm. I acquired to remain with the isolation until it dissipated. And I acquired to pardon, not them, because what they executed was unpardonable, but to pardon myself for bearing the load of their transgressions for so extended. This dawn I positioned by the pane with a steaming mug of herbal infusion, observing the sun ascend over the iced pond. The heavens seeped into radiant tones of rose and amber, adorning the frost and glaze with a stunning allure. Wilkins was nestled at my soles, his gentle, uniform respiration a soothing cadence in the tranquil space. For the initial time, and as far as I could recollect, I sensed a feeling of serenity, a full and absolute serenity. They had attempted to annul my designation, but I had uncovered myself. They had attempted to inter me, but they never realized that I was a colonel. And here, in the subdued seclusion of a Vermont season, I was ultimately commencing to flourish. My narrative has uncovered its serenity, but I realize that for many of you tuning in, your own narrative is still developing. Perhaps you've perceived an echo of your own kin in mine, or experienced the bite of being underestimated. If you have, please recognize this. You are not isolated, and your value is not established by those who decline to perceive it. If my odyssey has echoed with you, please enroll in our platform. There are additional narratives like mine awaiting to be narrated. Narratives of toughness, of uncovering potency in the fractured locales, and of constructing a fresh morning, one dawn at a time.